The woods around Pine Hollow never stay quiet for long. Even on windless nights, when the leaves hang heavy and the moon glows like a dying ember caught between the treetops, something moves out there, soft and deliberate, as if the trees themselves are breathing. Folks in the valley have learned to ignore the murmurs rising from those thickets, to pretend the echoes threading through the underbrush belong to nothing more than restless birds. But everyone knows better. The old families remember. They always do. In 1887, before the land was parceled and tamed, a single cabin stood alone in the ravine, swallowed by vines and shadows. The Vesper Place. Most children grew up hearing warnings about it, and most adults pretended they didn't. The story of the Triplet sisters, three pale, identical girls who kept to themselves, who moved in eerie unison, who stared a second too long when spoken to, hung over the region like a fog that never quite lifted. Their father was a quiet, brooding man whose presence seemed to dim whatever light tried to enter a room. After their mother disappeared one winter and the rumors thickened, folks stopped visiting altogether. Some say the sisters were strange from birth, as if they shared one mind and spoke with one voice. Some claim they were seen whispering to empty corners of the woods or wandering near the well long after midnight, their white nightgowns drifting like spirits through the trees. But the rumors that unsettled people most were the ones nobody dared to repeat above a whisper, stories of what went on inside the cabin, the kind that made lantern flames quiver when spoken aloud. Time might have buried their tale if not for the voices that started again this autumn. Low, lilting, almost melodic, rising from the ravine on nights when the moon thins to a sickle. The dogs refuse to go down there now, and travelers swear they hear three girls humming in perfect harmony somewhere beyond the tree line. And when the fog settles just right, when the night is too still for comfort, some say you can glimpse figures, three of them, moving in the dark, hands clasped, heads tilted toward some unseen caller, waiting for someone foolish enough to follow their voices into the woods. The valley has known fear before, but nothing like this, not since the night the Vesper cabin burned, and the Triplet sisters were last seen standing in the glow of the flames, watching their father scream inside. The disappearance of the traveler began as nothing more than another whispered warning carried between tavern porches and church steps, the kind of hushed tale locals share when the nights turn long and the woods feel too close. His name wasn't recorded clearly, some called him a drifter, others swore he was a surveyor passing through, but everyone agreed he arrived in the valley with a confident stride and the easy arrogance of a man who believed no forest could unsettle him. He stayed only one night at the creekside inn before setting out at dawn toward Pine Hollow, ignoring the quiet attempts of the innkeeper's wife to dissuade him. The woods had their own rules, and he seemed the sort who didn't think such things applied to him. By afternoon, a hunter found his horse wandering near the old ridge path, saddle still strapped tight but the reins tangled around a branch as if the animal had jerked free in a panic. The traveler himself was nowhere in sight. Searchers were gathered, lanterns lit early despite the sun still clinging to the sky, and they followed the faint trail of boot prints leading toward the dense thickets on the hollow's northern edge. It was there, caught against a rotted log, that they found the first sign of what had happened, a single torn page of a travel journal, its edges damp and muddied, the ink running only slightly where mist had touched it. Most of the writing was ordinary, observations about the land, the weather, the narrow deer paths threading through the underbrush, until the last line. The final words were written with shaky strokes, as if the writer's hand trembled or he had scrawled them in a sudden rush. It said, "Saw three girls in white between the trees. Whispering. Not sure if they were calling me or warning me." After that, the paper ended sharply, torn so violently the fibers frayed like the edge of a ripped garment. This single clue was enough to bring an old fear back to the valley, one most residents had learned to fold away deep in memory. The mention of three girls in white stirred something in the older families, something they pretended not to recognize but couldn't ignore. The search continued through the evening, lantern light bobbing through fog as men shouted the traveler's name into darkness that swallowed their voices whole. No footprints appeared beyond the ridge. No sign of struggle was found. It was as though he had stepped between the trees and been quietly lifted out of the world, leaving behind nothing but the trembling line about the whispering girls no one had spoken of for decades. Local families spoke of the Vesper triplets, Ada, Elsie, and Mara, with the kind of wary reverence reserved for storms or spirits, things that could not be understood but certainly could not be ignored. Their story had been buried beneath decades of silence, yet the traveler's strange journal note began pulling old memories back to the surface, memories that many elders wished had remained untouched. The triplets were born during a winter so bitter that livestock froze standing in fields and whole branches snapped under the weight of ice. Their mother, a soft-spoken woman who rarely ventured into town, died within weeks of their birth under what neighbors called circumstances better left unspoken. After that, the sisters were raised entirely by their father in a cabin sunken deep in a ravine where the hills bent inward and sunlight struggled to reach the ground. Those who met the girls in their early years described them as eerily calm, almost too aware for their age, watching adults with eyes that never quite blinked at the right moments. They rarely spoke individually. Instead, one sister would answer a question while the other two stood close behind, nodding in unison as though the words belonged to all of them equally. Their identical dresses, sewn crudely by their father, were always white, though the fabric often carried the grayness of damp earth and wood smoke. The image of the three girls standing hand in hand at the edge of the tree line became an unsettling fixture for anyone traveling the narrow road that wound past the Vesper property. What unsettled the townsfolk most was how isolated the family became as the years passed. The father stopped visiting the trading post altogether. No one saw the girls at church. The midwife who had delivered them left town abruptly, refusing to speak of her final visit to the Vesper cabin. Hunters claimed they heard children's laughter drifting from the ravine even on nights when no lantern glow could be seen from the homestead. Others swore they witnessed the triplets wandering the woods long after midnight, whispering in voices too soft to understand but too rhythmic to dismiss as simple play. Despite the whispered warnings, no one dared confront the father directly. Something about him, his heavy gaze, his silence, the sharpness in his posture, made even the bravest men avert their eyes. Stories of what occurred inside the cabin circulated in private, spoken only by those who had glimpsed strange shadows moving behind its windows or heard hushed arguments carried on the wind. Over time, the Vesper triplets became less like children and more like a legend, a local cautionary tale, until the travelers' disappearance forced everyone to consider the possibility that the girls, or whatever they had become, were not a memory at all but a presence still lingering in the woods surrounding Pine Hollow. The rumors surrounding the Vesper triplets had long been dismissed as a mixture of campfire tales and the valley's peculiar way of preserving its darkest memories, but everything changed when a violent autumn storm rolled across the Missouri Ozarks and tore open a piece of land that had remained untouched for decades. Lightning struck the ridge above Pine Hollow with such force that the ground split and the old trees toppled like brittle bones. When the storm passed and the smoke cleared, townsfolk climbed the ravine to inspect the damage and discovered that the shifting earth had exposed the moss-covered foundation of what had once been the Vesper homestead. Stones long hidden beneath roots and earth now sat bare under the gray morning light, forming the unmistakable outline of a house that had vanished from every map and every mention since the night it burned. It was as though the forest had been keeping the ruins secret, holding them tight until the storm pried them loose. The sight stirred unease in the valley not felt in years. Folks who had convinced themselves that the story of the triplets had ended with the fire found those old fears returning like unwelcome visitors. The foundation revealed more than stones. Charred wood still clung to certain corners, and fragments of belongings, bent forks, shattered porcelain, a rusted bedframe, lay scattered in the churned soil. With every object brought to the surface, memories that had been deliberately buried began floating back up with them. Elderly residents, once firm in their silence, found themselves whispering again about the night. Screams echoed through the ravine and the flames from the Vesper cabin turned the sky an unnatural shade of red. As searchers sifted through the debris, strange patterns emerged, circles charred into the ground where no fire should have reached, markings carved into the leftover beams, and soot-blackened stones arranged as though someone had placed them with intention rather than chaos. The unsettling arrangement made it impossible for the townsfolk to dismiss the whispers that had followed the family for years, rumors of unnatural rituals, secrets shared only in the dark, things taught to the sisters that no child should ever have known. Even the most rational residents admitted that the air around the ruins felt wrong, too cold despite the season, too still despite the wind moving freely through the trees. The storm had not simply revealed a forgotten structure, it had resurrected a history the valley had tried to erase. With the homestead once again exposed, the stories of the Vesper triplets no longer felt distant or exaggerated. Instead, they pressed at the edges of memory, demanding attention, as if the land itself was insisting that the truth buried beneath those foundations was not finished with the living just yet. When the deputy first followed the path leading down into the ravine, he expected to find little more than debris left behind by the storm, maybe an old pot, a snapped beam, the usual remnants that surface when the earth is disturbed. Instead, he found the remnants of something far more deliberate. The moment he stepped across the exposed foundation of the Vesper homestead, he felt the peculiar stillness that others had already remarked upon, a hush that settled over the place like a blanket pressed too tightly against the skin. He moved carefully, kicking aside fragments of charred wood, until his boot struck something solid buried just beneath the blackened dirt. Kneeling, he swept away the soil with his hands and uncovered the weathered lid of a small wooden chest, its hinges rusted but intact, its lock fused shut with heat from the long-ago fire. The sight of it made him pause. It wasn't the kind of thing one forgets in a burning house. It looked hidden on purpose. With some effort, he pried it open, the lock breaking clean off with a dull snap. Inside lay a collection of objects so peculiar and unsettling that he would later struggle to explain them without feeling a chill crawl along his spine. The chest held 3 dolls, each one crudely hand-stitched from scraps of cloth, their dresses pale and stained with age. What froze him in place was the detail that each doll's mouth had been sewn shut with coarse black thread pulled so tight it puckered the fabric around it. Their button eyes, mismatched and chipped, stared upward with an expression that seemed both vacant and pleading. They were nearly identical, positioned side by side, like the sisters themselves were often described. Alongside the dolls lay smaller items, a cracked mirror, a braid of hair tied neatly with twine, and what appeared to be a child's drawing scorched at the edges. The drawing showed 3 figures standing beneath a crooked tree, each holding hands, each depicted with an exaggeratedly round head and no mouth at all. No one could deny the strange, uneasy intention behind it. The deputy felt watched even though the woods around him were silent. For a brief moment, he wondered if he should close the chest and leave everything exactly as he had found it, as though disturbing the dolls might awaken something better left alone. When he brought the chest back to town, the reaction was instant and visceral. Older residents paled at the sight of the sewn mouths, whispering that the dolls matched stories they had heard as children about how the Vesper girls were taught to keep certain things unspoken. Younger residents, who had treated the legend as folklore, found themselves staring in uneasy silence at these physical remnants of a family that had vanished in fire yet clearly left behind more than ashes. The chest did not answer any questions. It only deepened them, suggesting that the secrets inside the Vesper cabin had been darker, more intentional, and far more real than anyone had dared to admit. Not long after the discovery of the chest, the nights around Pine Hollow began to change in ways that unsettled even those who prided themselves on never fearing the woods. At first it was subtle, a faint echo drifting through the trees, a soft rise and fall of sound that didn't belong to any animal native to the Ozarks. Some described it as humming, others as a broken melody carried on the wind, but everyone agreed it came from the direction of the old Vesper ravine. Hunters returning late from the ridge reported hearing what sounded like children talking just out of sight, the voices overlapping in a strange cadence that seemed almost practiced. When lanterns were raised and the woods searched, nothing stirred except the trembling branches of the undergrowth and the restless shadows slipping between the trunks. Dogs, however, sensed something far more tangible. Loyal hounds that had spent their entire lives roaming the hollows now whined and dug their paws into the dirt whenever they neared the well that sat on the edge of the uncovered foundation. The well had been part of the original Vesper property, its stone ring cracked by time but still intact. Normally, animals might sniff at such a place out of curiosity, yet these dogs refused to go anywhere near it. They barked furiously at the air above it or retreated with their tails tucked, as though something unseen lingered at the bottom. A few animals even broke into panicked sprints at the faintest whisper of sound coming from the ravine, their eyes wide and unblinking, refusing to calm down for hours afterward. As nights grew colder and the moon dipped earlier behind the ridge, the voices became clearer. Residents living closest to the woods said they heard 3 distinct tones, sometimes speaking, sometimes humming in perfect harmony. The sound was never loud, never aggressive, which somehow made it worse. It drifted through the branches like a lullaby meant for someone who should not be listening. People shut their windows tightly, yet the murmur slipped through cracks in old timber walls, curling into bedrooms like strands of cold fog. The well became a landmark everyone avoided, even at midday, because stories began circulating that if one leaned close enough to its edge, they could hear echoing words rising from the darkness below, rhythmic and low, as though recited from memory. Search parties went out more than once, determined to find the source of the voices, yet every attempt ended the same way. The sounds would vanish the moment the lanterns entered the ravine, replaced by a silence so complete it felt unnatural. No footprints were found, no broken branches, no sign of children or trespassers wandering the area. Yet the voices returned each time the search ended, drifting back across the valley with unnerving precision, as though whoever, or whatever, was creating them knew exactly when they were being sought and when it was safe to begin whispering again. The return of the voices forced many old memories to surface, but none stirred more unease than the confession offered by the valley's aging midwife, a woman who had lived long enough to see several generations born and buried in the Ozarks. She had always been regarded as level-headed, a figure anchored by practicality rather than superstition, someone who dismissed ghost stories with a wave of her hand. Yet when she heard about the torn journal page and the dolls with their sewn mouths, something in her hardened expression faltered. She requested to speak privately with the sheriff and a few trusted elders, and though her voice trembled only slightly, her words carved a deep silence through the room. She admitted that she had delivered the Vesper triplets on a night colder than any she could remember, a night where even the lantern flames flickered as though they wished to die out rather than illuminate what lay inside the cabin. The father had paced restlessly, not with the fear she normally saw in new fathers, but with a hyper-focused stillness that made her uneasy. She recalled how his eyes followed her every movement, not out of concern for his wife or the newborns, but as if he were waiting for something specific to happen. She had helped bring countless infants into the world, but the birth of Ada, Elsie, and Mara felt wrong in a way she could never articulate at the time. The girls did not cry as newborns typically do. They opened their eyes immediately, all three at once, blinking in eerie synchrony. Their mother, pale and exhausted, had whispered something unintelligible before slipping into unconsciousness, and the midwife remembered the father leaning close to listen, his expression unreadable before he turned back to the infants. What haunted her most, she confessed, occurred days later when she returned to check on the mother. Instead of being welcomed inside, she found the father already waiting at the door as if he had anticipated her visit. He allowed her in, but only briefly. The cabin felt colder than any home with a fire burning should, and the girls lay side by side on a cot, their tiny hands almost touching, their eyes tracking her every movement with an awareness she could not accept as normal. She noticed a small mark on each child's wrist, identical in placement and shape, like symbols pressed into their skin rather than formed naturally. When she asked about them, the father responded with a calmness that chilled her, they were born with what they need. She left the cabin that day with a weight in her chest, sensing that something deeply unnatural had taken root in that household. She kept her silence for decades, convincing herself that fear had clouded her memory, until the voices began again in the woods and the past she had tried to bury rose back up to meet her. When the storm exposed the Vesper Foundation, most townsfolk assumed the worst had already been unearthed. But the deepest piece of the mystery did not reveal itself until a group of searchers, driven by equal parts curiosity and dread, began clearing debris near what remained of the back wall. The ground there felt softer, the soil darker and strangely overturned, as if something beneath it had been recently disturbed despite decades of abandonment. One man's boot sank slightly into the earth, and when he stepped back, he heard a hollow sound, as though the dirt concealed empty space below. With shovels, lanterns, and hesitant determination, they dug until their tools struck wood. After brushing away layers of soil, they uncovered a crooked trapdoor reinforced with old iron straps and sealed with a latch so corroded it looked almost fossilized. The door resisted their efforts, groaning like a long-sleeping thing forced awake, but finally snapped open with a crack that echoed across the ravine. A cold draft rose from the darkness beneath, far colder than the autumn air above. Their lanterns revealed a steep set of steps descending into a narrow root cellar, its walls formed from uneven stones and packed earth. When the first man climbed down, he stopped halfway, struck by a sight that made his breath catch in his throat. The cellar walls were lined with claw marks, long and frantic, as though someone, or several someones, had scraped their nails across the stone until they bled. The gouges varied in depth and direction, overlapping in chaotic patterns that told a story of desperation rather than simple storage use. Some marks looked small enough to belong to a child. Others were deeper, made with a force that seemed impossible for human hands. At the far end of the cellar, the lantern light fell upon a rusted lantern lying on its side next to a tiny rocking chair, its runners carved with delicate patterns now warped by age. The chair faced the wall, not the stairs, positioned as though someone had placed it intentionally, expecting a child to sit there. Dust covered its surface, yet the ground beneath it was oddly disturbed, as if it had been moved recently or rocked by something unseen. A frayed length of rope lay coiled nearby, though its purpose was unclear, and beneath a loose stone someone found a tattered scrap of fabric embroidered with the same crude symbol the midwife described on the triplets' wrists. The cellar felt suffocating, not because of its size but because of the oppressive sense that the air carried memories too heavy for the living. Every object seemed to hint at confinement, ritual, or something far more sinister, and no one could determine whether the cellar had been a place the triplets were kept, visited, or used for reasons the valley was not yet prepared to understand. The searchers did not linger. They climbed out quickly, sealing the trapdoor behind them, though sealing it brought no comfort, because each man knew they had uncovered a part of the Vesper story meant to stay buried, and whatever had left those claw marks had left them with intent. The discovery of the cellar stirred fear throughout Pine Hollow, but it was the appearance of the old hermit that pushed the valley from unease into full dread. Most people knew of him only through rumors passed around campfires and fishing shacks, whispered tales of a man who lived deep in the woods by choice, avoiding the town as if it carried a sickness he refused to catch. His cabin sat miles from the nearest road, tucked behind a curtain of dense pines where even seasoned hunters rarely ventured. He had not spoken to anyone willingly in years, and some believed he no longer spoke at all. Yet one gray dawn, after the voices had echoed through the valley for a third night in a row, he limped into town without warning, coat torn, eyes sunken, and breath raspy, as though he had spent days running from something that stalked just behind him. He asked for the sheriff by name, something that surprised everyone because they had assumed he had long forgotten the world outside the tree-line. When brought inside and offered water he barely touched, he began speaking in a voice roughened by years of silence. He said he had come because the valley was pretending not to see what was happening, and the woods were running out of patience. He insisted he had seen the Vesper triplets long after the night the cabin burned, long after the valley declared them dead and buried. The room fell silent as he continued, describing a morning decades earlier when he had been trapping near a narrow creek not far from the ravine. Mist had settled so thickly over the water that visibility was little more than a few yards, but he had heard soft footsteps approaching. Expecting a deer, he raised his bow, only to see 3 young girls walking in a straight line along the opposite bank. He recognized them immediately. Everyone in the valley had known their faces before the fire. What froze him in place was not their appearance but the way they moved, without sound, without hesitation, without so much as acknowledging the forest around them. They wore white nightgowns, unstained despite the mud beneath their bare feet, and held hands so tightly that their knuckles appeared white even through the mist. He called out once, instinctively, but none of them turned. Instead, they paused in unison, tilted their heads as if listening to something he could not hear, then continued walking until the fog swallowed them whole. He never told anyone because he believed no one would believe him, and he had spent years trying to convince himself it had been a trick of light, a memory misfiring, or exhaustion toying with his mind. But the recent voices, the dolls, the cellar, the unearthed foundation, everything matched what he had tried so desperately to forget. And now, he said, the valley needed to accept one unbearable truth. Whatever those girls had become, they had never left the woods at all. The valley had endured strange nights before, but nothing prepared the residents for the series of fires that erupted in the weeks following the hermit's confession. They began quietly, almost cautiously, as if testing how closely the valley was paying attention. The first blaze broke out near the abandoned schoolhouse on the West Ridge, a place tied to the Vesper family only through faint memory and faded attendance records showing the triplets were once enrolled but never attended a single day. The fire consumed the structure in minutes, leaving only warped metal hinges and a patch of scorched earth. Locals blamed lightning until they realized the sky had been clear and the air still that night. The following week, another fire ignited at the old mill by the riverbank, a site the Vesper father once worked before withdrawing entirely into isolation. Flames rose so suddenly and violently that the river itself glowed orange, reflecting a storm of sparks drifting across the water like fireflies. Panic spread as patterns emerged. Each fire occurred at a location with some connection, however small, to the Vesper family's past. The church storage shed burned next, where the triplets' mother had once volunteered before her mysterious decline. Then the orchard on Hollow's Bend caught fire, the very place where townsfolk had whispered their earliest suspicions about the father, exchanging uneasy glances whenever the girls wandered nearby. Every blaze started under calm weather, leaving no tracks, no accelerants, no human signs. Only ash, twisted frames, and lingering smoke remained by dawn. The flames behaved unnaturally, ignoring wind direction, leaping across gaps where fire should not have spread, burning only what carried the stain of the Vesper history while leaving the surrounding woods untouched, as though guided by deliberate purpose. People stopped speaking openly about the triplets, fearing their names might invite attention. Some whispered that the fires were a warning, a purification meant to erase the fragments of the past the storm had unearthed. Others believed something was moving through the valley, something that remembered every slight, every rumor, every secret the townsfolk had buried about that cursed family. Those who lived closest to the burned sites reported strange activity before each blaze, a sudden drop in temperature, the faint echo of 3 voices humming in perfect harmony, and once, a witness claimed to see 3 pale figures standing between the trees just moments before the orchard erupted in flames. The sheriff tried to reassure everyone, but even he could not ignore the mounting evidence that these fires were no accident. By the time the ninth blaze ignited near the remnants of the Vesper well, the valley had reached a collective, silent understanding. The past was not simply returning, it was cleansing itself, piece by piece, with a precision too unnatural to blame on human hands. As the surviving family members confront the last remaining clues, they begin to realize that the events they once believed were shaped by supernatural forces were instead created by the actions of people who knew exactly what they were doing. The old letters, the broken objects buried beneath the floorboards, the strange markings left on the cellar beams, each piece comes together to expose the deliberate choices that pushed the family toward isolation and tragedy. What shocks them most is not the violence itself, but how carefully it was disguised as misfortune. The discovery of the hidden journal becomes the turning point, a document written in fragmented sentences that reveal how one person manipulated everyone around them, feeding old grudges, exaggerated fears of outsiders, and stories of curses to maintain control over the household. As the survivors read through the entries, they understand that many of the accidents that shaped their childhood were not accidents at all but carefully orchestrated events meant to keep them dependent and afraid. The realization forces them to question everything they ever believed about loyalty and protection. Even the relatives they once trusted had unknowingly played a part, repeating stories passed down from earlier generations without realizing how those stories were being twisted. What remains most disturbing is how normal the manipulation had seemed at the time, hidden behind routines, chores, and rules that everyone followed without question. When the truth finally surfaces, it strips away the last illusion of innocence surrounding the family history. The confrontation that follows is filled with confusion and anger, not because the survivors want revenge, but because they struggle to understand how long they allowed such control to shape their lives. They revisit the places where the events unfolded, the cabin room where certain family members were never allowed to sleep, the path behind the house where they were told not to wander, the storage shed whose locked door they feared to open. Each location reminds them of how small their world once was and how tightly they had been held within boundaries they never questioned. The emotional weight of this realization sits heavily on them, but it also gives them the clarity they had never been allowed to have. For the first time, they can separate fear created by stories from fear created by real human choices, and that separation gives them the strength to decide how they want the future to look, freed from the shadows that once shaped every moment of their past.